It was a quiet Thursday afternoon in the small town of Maple Grove, Ohio. The kind of town where the biggest event of the week is the Friday night church potluck. And most houses have rocking chairs out front that rarely go unused. That day, the leaves were starting to turn amber and rust, and the breeze smelled faintly of fireplace smoke and fall. But when Carl Simmons, a 40-year-old father of 3, walked through the door of his modest two-story home, something felt off. No sound of the kettle whistling in the kitchen. No smell of chili simmering. No gentle humming from his wife, Marlene, who always sang old Patsy Cline songs when she cooked. Just an eerie, heavy silence. His boots echoed against the hardwood floor, and when he called out, no one answered until his oldest daughter, Emily, appeared at the top of the stairs, with a look that Carl would never forget for as long as he lived. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice brittle. "Mom's gone." At first, Carl thought she meant something simple. Maybe Marlene had gone to the store. Maybe to her sisters in Dayton. Maybe just needed a break. But, as Emily explained haltingly, eyes wide and confused, Carl felt the floor begin to give way beneath him. Marlene had come home early from work the day before. She seemed frazzled, anxious, like someone being chased by thoughts, too fast to catch. She had thrown some clothes into a small suitcase, kissed little Sophie on the forehead, told Emily to take care of her sisters, and walked out the door. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't say when she'd be back. And just like that, she vanished. Carl tried calling her, over and over. No answer. He left voicemails, gentle ones at first, then pleading, then desperate. He texted, he emailed. Nothing. Radio silence. On the second day, he called her parents. Her mother's voice was calm, too calm, and her father sounded tired. They said Marlene was safe, that she was with them, that she just needed some time. They asked him politely, carefully, not to come. "Not yet. Be patient, Carl," her mother said. "Please, just give her a little space." But patience, Carl would soon learn, has a shelf life. He began to reach out to anyone who might know more. Her sister, her old college roommate, a coworker, at the pharmacy where Marlene worked as a technician. One by one, the doors of information shut gently in his face. "Haven't seen her. She left early that day. I don't really know what's going on, Carl." By the third day, the house felt heavier than ever. Not because it was empty, but because it was incomplete. There was a difference. An absence that didn't just leave silence, but questions. A void that hummed in every corner. Carl watched his girls try to piece together their own understanding. Emily tried to keep the household running, making sandwiches, helping with homework. Sophie kept asking when her mom was coming home, and little Rachel had taken to sleeping in Carl's bed, clutching her mom's flannel shirt like a security blanket. Carl himself barely slept. He would sit in the living room past midnight, sipping cold coffee, staring at the front door, like it might open if he just wished hard enough. He didn't cry. Not yet. He was still in the stage where everything feels surreal, where you float a few inches above your life, watching it play out like a bad television drama you can't turn off. And then came the theories. The mind games. He wondered if she had a breakdown, a midlife crisis, some kind of trauma from the past resurfacing. Maybe something had happened at work. He even Googled temporary amnesia at 2 a.m., but every theory eventually led him to the one possibility he didn't want to entertain someone else. Another man, an affair, a double life. The word sounded dirty in his mouth. Affair. It didn't fit Marlene. She wasn't that kind of woman, or at least she never used to be. And yet Carl couldn't shake the image of her packing in a hurry. The way she had looked. Not angry, not sad, but haunted. And then just gone. Gone. How do you explain to your children that their mother has vanished without a single goodbye? That you, their father, have no answers? That every day without her is like standing in the middle of a field, listening for thunder that never comes. They say grief feels like a storm. But this felt like waiting for one that never arrives. And so Carl waited, and hoped, and lied to his daughters, to his friends, to himself. Because the truth wasn't just unbearable. It was unimaginable. But, in Maple Grove, the truth was already circling quietly, like a crow waiting for a field to fall silent. It wouldn't be long before it landed. And when it did, it would shatter not just the silence, but everything Carl thought he knew about his wife, his marriage, and the life they had built together. And that's when the unraveling began. The silence stretched on for 5 days. By then, Carl had memorized every creak of the house, every tick of the kitchen clock. The girls had stopped asking when Marlene would be home. They just looked at him differently now, not quite afraid, but wary, as if they could see that something fundamental had broken inside their father, even if they didn't yet know what. He tried to hold the line, tried to believe, but something inside him had already started to shift, like a timber beam quietly splintering under weight no one else could see. Then, on a rainy Sunday morning, everything changed. Carl had called the police not because he believed Marlene was in danger anymore, but because he was desperate for someone in authority to do something. Maybe they could knock on her parents' door, maybe force a conversation. But what came next wasn't a police report. It was a phone call from his father-in-law. A short call, strained, like someone being forced to say something they'd hoped they'd never have to. "Carl," the voice said quietly. "She's been seeing someone. For a long time. We just found out." That was it. A sentence. A truth that opened like a blade. Carl sat in the den, phone slipping from his hand, staring at the beige carpet beneath his boots. For a moment, he felt nothing. Not sadness. Not rage. Just numbness. The kind of numbness that tells you your reality has just shifted, and you won't truly understand how until much, much later. Marlene had been having an affair, not just recently. Not a one-night mistake. Not something that could be swept under a rug and prayed over. According to her sister, who finally admitted her part in the cover-up, it had been going on for at least 2 years. Maybe more. The man she had been involved with, a senior manager at the medical supply company she'd transferred to 5 years ago. Divorced. Wealthy. Charming. From what Carl had heard. The kind of man who traveled often, had season tickets to everything, and didn't have to ask permission to go golfing on weekends. The affair had started quietly: texts, lunches, work events that went late, then trips, then lies. Carl's knees went weak as the timeline began to stitch itself together in his mind. The unexplained weekends, the cancelled family vacations, the late meetings that never made sense, the nights she came home quiet, almost guilty, but masked it with a tired smile, and said, "Rough day, honey. I just want to shower." He had believed her every time. That was the part that hurt the most. Not that she had cheated, not even that she had lied, but that she had done it so easily, so fluidly, with no tremble in her voice, no shift in her eyes. Carl had trusted her with everything. His secrets, his youth, his life. And in return, she had given pieces of herself to someone else, while still kissing their daughters goodnight and telling him she loved him. But the cruelest twist wasn't the betrayal. It was the reason he finally learned the truth. The man, her affair partner, had died of a heart attack. Sudden, unexpected, alone. That's why she'd vanished. She wasn't running from Carl. She was mourning someone else. That realization broke something in him that would never fully heal. His wife hadn't ghosted him because of guilt or fear. She had ghosted him to grieve a man who was never supposed to exist in their story. Marlene's parents had known for days. Her sister had known for longer. Even her co-workers, at least. One of them had suspected. Carl was the last to know. The husband, the father, the man who still wore his wedding ring, because he couldn't imagine taking it off. And now the pieces fit. Every detail snapped into place like a cruel puzzle. The frantic packing, the silence, the way her mother's voice trembled on the phone. It was never about space. It was about covering. She hadn't just betrayed their marriage. She had turned her family into accomplices. Carl sat in his garage that night, the rain tapping gently on the roof, like a metronome for heartbreak, trying to make sense of it all. He thought about the time they remodeled the kitchen together, about the way she used to laugh when he danced with a dish towel, about their 10th anniversary trip to Maine, when they sat on a quiet dock, feet dangling in cold water, and promised they'd still be dancing when they were 70. Had any of it meant anything to her? The mind, when wounded deeply enough, does a strange thing. It doesn't just remember. It rewrites. It questions everything. It poisons every memory with a single thought. Was she already lying back then? And that's where Carl found himself, standing in the ruins of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but now under the weight of truth had crumbled to dust. But even as betrayal burned through his chest like a fever, another feeling began to grow. Determination. He still had 3 daughters upstairs, 3 girls who needed a father, who didn't disappear when life got hard, who needed to see what strength looked like. Not the loud, angry kind, but the quiet, steady kind that holds a family together when everything else falls apart. And so, Carl made a choice. He would not scream. He would not beg. He would not chase. But he would demand answers. Because if Marlene was ever going to come back to that house, she wouldn't be walking through that door without telling the whole truth. Not just to him, but to the daughters who deserved better. And that's when Carl decided. The next time he saw her, she would have to face everything. The silence was over. Now came the reckoning. If this story touched something in you, maybe a memory, a scar, or just a quiet place in your heart, don't forget to subscribe. We share real stories from real people, the kind that remind us we're not alone. Heartbreak, healing, and hope. You'll find it all right here. Click subscribe and join us for more unforgettable Reddit stories. It had been 18 days since Marlene disappeared. 18 long, aching days filled with restless nights, unanswered questions, and the slow suffocation of truth unraveling in silence. Carl Simmons had learned to move through his home like a ghost, going through the motions, packing school lunches, driving his daughters to basketball practice, keeping the lawn trimmed, even showing up at church on Sundays with a forced smile and a hollowed-out heart. But something inside him had shifted the day he found out about the affair. The denial had burned away. In its place stood something sharper: clarity, maybe, or exhaustion. He was tired of waiting, tired of hiding the truth from his daughters, tired of pretending the woman who had promised him forever hadn't just lit a match and walked away. That's why when Marlene's parents called to say she wanted to come home, Carl didn't panic. He didn't beg her to stay away either. Instead, he gave a simple condition. If she wanted to step back into that house, she had to look him in the eye and tell the truth. All of it. She agreed. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Maple Grove when she finally returned. Carl was sitting on the edge of the living room couch, watching the clock. The girls were upstairs, headphones on, pretending not to care, but the silence was heavy. You could feel them listening. The front door creaked open, and Marlene stepped in, soaked from the rain, but still wearing the same coat Carl remembered from her last exit. She didn't speak at first, just stood there in the doorway, dripping, clutching a duffel bag like she wasn't sure whether to drop it or run. Carl didn't move. She made the first move, stepping toward him with a look that was more apology than courage. When she tried to hug him, he turned away. That was the first moment he realized he wasn't the same man she left behind. They sat in the kitchen, a place once filled with laughter and Saturday morning pancakes, now cold and sterile like a waiting room. Carl leaned forward, hands folded tightly, voice steady but low. "I need you to tell me," he said, "from the beginning. All of it." Marlene looked down. Her lips trembled, but no words came. He waited 5 seconds, then 10, then longer. The silence between them stretched like barbed wire. When she finally spoke, it wasn't an explanation. It was a whisper. "I'm not ready." Carl felt something inside him snap. Not loudly, not violently, just quietly, like a door locking. From the inside, "You don't get to say that anymore," he said, voice still calm. "You had 18 days. You ghosted your husband, your children. You mourned another man while we sat here wondering if you were alive. You owe us the truth." Still nothing. Just silence. She didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't deny. She just stared at the kitchen floor, like it might somehow absorb her. So, Carl did what he promised himself he wouldn't. He started laying it all out, every piece of the puzzle he'd uncovered. The texts, the weekends, the job transfer, the connection with her sister, the lies, the man, the death. He didn't scream, but the anger came through in his cadence, in the way his fingers tapped the table between words. Each sentence, a hammer, each pause, a nail. Still, Marlene didn't interrupt, didn't push back, didn't even flinch. She just sat there, small and still, while the storm inside Carl poured out. And when it was all over, when the kitchen fell silent, he finally asked the question that had haunted him since the moment the truth surfaced. Was he worth it? Her head stayed bowed. No answer. Not even a shake. Carl leaned in, voice softer now, almost pleading. "What did I do to lose you, Marlene? What did we do? Did you ever even love me at all?" Nothing. Just more silence. And that silence hurt more than any confession could have. Upstairs, a door slammed. Carl's heart sank. He hadn't noticed that Emily had been listening. Neither had Marlene. But there it was, the damage, unfolding. In real time, their oldest daughter, once quiet and composed, now furious. She came down the stairs, eyes red, jaw clenched, and tore into her mother with every ounce of pain she'd been holding inside. Words flew like daggers, accusations, betrayal, grief masked as rage. Marlene fled, ran up the stairs, locked herself in the bedroom she used to share with Carl, and left the rest of the house in shambles. Carl didn't chase her. He sat at the table, staring at the chair she'd just left, hands trembling, breath uneven. For the first time since this ordeal began, he cried not from sadness, not even from betrayal, but from the weight of it all. The unbearable heaviness of being the only adult left holding the pieces of a life that had already shattered. Only the youngest daughter, Rachel, dared knock on her mother's door later that night. The rest of them avoided her. Emily refused to speak. Sophie wept silently in her room. Carl sat outside on the porch until midnight, listening to the wind, wondering how you forgive someone who doesn't even try to be forgiven. And still, he didn't scream, because the storm wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Carl made a quiet decision, one he'd been circling around for days. He would ask Marlene to leave. Not as punishment, not out of cruelty, but because whatever bridge had once connected them was now ashes. He couldn't keep his daughters in a home filled with so much tension, so many ghosts. He needed space. He needed truth. And maybe, just maybe, he needed to start imagining a life that didn't include the woman he once believed he'd grow old with. But first, he had to face the final chapter of her story, because Marlene wasn't done, and neither was the truth. Carl had always tried to shield his daughters from pain. He believed that if he held the storm inside long enough, he spoke calmly, smiled gently, kept the home running, they wouldn't feel the full weight of what was happening. But heartbreak, like water, finds the cracks. And when it comes through, it doesn't knock, it floods. The night Marlene returned and sat in the kitchen across from Carl in cold silence. Their conversation, or lack thereof, had sent aftershocks through the house. Upstairs, behind slightly ajar doors and earbuds quietly removed, 3 girls had been listening. The youngest, Rachel, didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. That her mom was crying again behind locked doors. That Dad's voice had lost its softness. That Emily, the oldest, had stopped calling her sweetheart and started slamming doors. But it was Sophie, the middle child, who broke first. The following morning, Carl found her curled on the laundry room floor, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes puffy from crying. She had overheard every word. About the affair, about the man who died, about how their mother had left them not in fear, not by accident, but by choice. Her voice trembled when she asked, "Was it because we weren't enough?" Carl froze. That was the question, the one no parent ever wants to hear. The one he'd feared from the beginning. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because no answer could fix it. He knelt beside her and whispered, "This was never about you, Sophie. None of this was your fault." But she didn't look convinced. Because children don't measure pain with logic. They measure it with silence, and Marlene's silence had been deafening. Later that day, Carl tried to talk to Emily. She had barely spoken since her outburst the night before. She stayed in her room, headphones on, sketchbook open but untouched. When Carl gently tapped on her door, she didn't respond. He opened it anyway. She was sitting on her bed, staring blankly at the wall. No tears, just a look he recognized too well and hardened. The same look he saw in the mirror every morning now. "Dad," she said without turning. "I heard everything." Carl sat at the edge of the bed. "I know." She didn't even try to explain, Emily said flatly. She just stood there, like a coward, like we weren't worth the truth. Carl wanted to defend Marlene. For a second, a reflex, some old habit of partnership, pitched in his throat, but he swallowed it. The truth was, Emily was right. He put his hand gently on hers. "I wish I could change what you heard. I wish I could erase it, but I can't. All I can do now is be here. For all of you." That night, the collapse was complete. The family dinner table, once sacred, sat half full. Carl ate in silence with Sophie and Rachel, while Emily remained upstairs. Marlene never came down. The clinking of forks on plates was the only sound in the house. It was the silence Carl had hoped to avoid, but it was here now, wrapping around them like fog cold, heavy, and impossible to see through. After the girls went to bed, Carl stood outside Marlene's door and knocked. No answer. "I think you should stay with your sister," he said through the door. "At least for now. The girls, they need space. I need space." There was a pause. Then, softly, the sound of muffled crying. He didn't wait. He walked back downstairs, poured himself a glass of water, and sat on the couch in the dark, staring out the window at the still night. The porch light flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. And Carl felt the full gravity of what had happened. He had tried so hard to protect his daughters, to carry their pain and his own. But now, it was out in the open, raw, exposed, unfixable. He thought about how fragile children are, Not in body, but in spirit. How easily betrayal can break something sacred in them. Not just trust in a parent, but in the world, in love, in promises. And yet, Carl also knew something else. Children watch more than they listen. They learn not from the words we say, but from the way we survive, so he would survive. Not because he wanted to, but because they needed him to. He would show them that you can be hurt, and still stand. You can be betrayed, and still believe. You can lose everything and still choose to be kind. That was the only way forward. Because the pain wasn't done. Not yet. The worst, Carl feared, was still ahead. And soon, the woman who had unraveled their home would try to stitch herself back into it. But the thread was frayed, and the damage toward it been already done. Carl had never been the kind of man who believed in giving up. He was raised in a time and place where vows were sacred, where you didn't just walk away because things got hard. You patched the roof. You fixed the fence. You forgave the big ones. That's what marriage was to him. Choosing the same person, over and over again. Even when they weren't easy to love. But standing in the middle of his broken kitchen, with his children scattered across a home that no longer felt like theirs, Carl realized something that shook him to his core. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about being angry or betrayed. It was about choosing peace over chaos. And it was time to let go. In the week that followed, Marlene's return, Carl had truly tried to give her space to come clean. He waited for honesty, for remorse, for her to step forward, not just as a wife who'd made a mistake, but as a mother who understood the gravity of what she had done. Instead, she hovered, apologized in circles, cried quietly behind closed doors but never opened them. She would knock on Carl's door at night, asking to talk, but when he opened it, she had no words, just watery eyes and trembling lips. One evening, after a long day of work and school runs, Carl found her waiting in the kitchen again. She was holding a mug of tea and looked like she'd been standing there for hours. "I need to ask you something," she said gently. "Is this really how it's going to be? Are we really not going to talk about us?" Carl took a deep breath. "You had 18 years to talk to me, Marlene. Then you had 18 days to decide what kind of truth you'd bring back. You said nothing. And now you want me to pretend this is something we can just fix." Her eyes welled up. She started to say something, but Carl held up his hand. "I'm filing," he said. The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. "I've already talked to a lawyer," he continued. "The papers are drawn up. All that's left is your signature." Marlene blinked, as if she hadn't truly believed he would go through with it. And maybe, until that moment, neither had Carl. But something had changed. The man who once clung to hope like a life raft now saw the truth clearly. Staying wasn't strength. Not this time. Strength was walking away from the fire when you knew it would only burn you again. Marlene didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just sat down slowly at the table, wrapped her hands around her mug, and whispered, "Do the girls know?" Carl shook his head. "Not yet, but they will. And when they ask why, I'll tell them the truth. That I gave you every chance to be honest. That I waited. That I hoped. And that, in the end, the silence hurt more than the betrayal." He stood quietly, watching her shoulders sag under the weight of it all. For a second, he saw a flash of the woman he had once loved, the girl with the bright laugh and bare feet, dancing in their first apartment while he cooked grilled cheese on a hot plate. But that girl was gone, and the woman before him, this version of Marlene, had become a stranger. That night, he told the girls. He sat them down on the couch, each one curled into a blanket, eyes cautious, waiting. He didn't dress it up. Didn't use vague words or empty promises. "Your mother and I are getting divorced," he said softly. "And I want you to know, it's not because of you. None of this is your fault." Emily nodded, jaw clenched but unsurprised. Sophie cried. Rachel asked if they'd have to move. Carl answered every question. Held them all as long as they needed. And when they finally went to bed, he stood alone in the hallway, staring at their bedroom doors, whispering a silent promise. "You will grow up safe. You will grow up strong. And I will carry the weight, so you don't have to." The following morning, Marlene packed a bag and left for her sister's house. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No scene. Just the soft click of the front door closing behind her. Carl stood in the living room, coffee in hand, listening to the quiet. But this time, it was different. This silence didn't ache. It didn't haunt. It breathed. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, the stillness after the collapse. When the dust begins to settle and the world dares to imagine itself whole again. Carl didn't know what the road ahead would look like. He didn't pretend the pain would vanish overnight, but for the first time in weeks, he had clarity. He had chosen to stop bleeding for someone who wouldn't even hand him a bandage, and in doing so, he had taken the first real step not toward forgetting, but toward healing. Because the next chapter wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the girls, about rebuilding, about choosing life, not just survival. And as the sun rose slowly over Maple Grove, painting gold across the rooftops, Carl closed his eyes and whispered, almost to himself, "I'm still standing." And his story was finally ready to begin again. It happened on a Wednesday night in early December. The kind of night where the cold sits deep in your bones, and even the wind sounds tired. The house was still, cloaked in a blanket of sleeping children and unspoken truths. Carl was sitting in the garage, engine off, radio off, headlights dark, just sitting behind the wheel of his old Chevy with the keys dangling from the ignition. It had become his routine, an hour of quiet, where he could feel alone without really being gone. Didn't expect the knock on the window. Marlene stood there, in her winter coat, arms folded tight like she was holding herself together. Her eyes were red, and not from the cold. "I need to talk," she said. Carl hesitated, then pushed open the passenger door. She slid in without a word, shut it softly, and stared ahead, like she didn't dare look at him. They sat there, shoulder to shoulder, not touching, in the shadows of their shared life. And then she started to speak. What came next wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't clean. It was messy, broken, scattered. But it was real. She told him everything. About how she'd first met the man. His name was Alan, nearly 5 years ago. Long before Carl had even known she was considering a job change. He had been a regional director at the medical supply company where she now worked. They met at a hiring conference in Louisville. At first, it was just networking. Then emails. Then coffee. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, "but it did." Carl didn't interrupt. She admitted that the affair had started slowly. Emotional at first. Confiding. Venting. Flirting. Then came the texts. The photos. The hotel rooms. The lies. Vacations with the girls that never happened. Traffic jams that never existed. Overtime shifts that weren't on any schedule. She spoke of the thrill, the danger, the escape from routine. How the predictability of family life had dulled her. How she'd begun to resent the very stability Carl had worked so hard to build. "I got bored," she confessed, voice cracking. "I didn't stop loving you. I just stopped noticing how much you loved me." Carl stared straight ahead, his hands locked on the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. She cried. Not loud sobs, but quiet, broken ones. The kind that come from somewhere deeper than regret, shame. Maybe. She reached into her coat pocket and handed him a folded stack of papers, 5 handwritten pages of dates, events, and explanations. "I needed you to know everything," she said, "even if you never forgive me." Carl unfolded the pages and scanned them in the dim light. Her handwriting was shaky but familiar. Every lie he had suspected, every weekend he had questioned, every half-excuse she had mumbled through, clenched teeth, it was all there. Confirmed. Confessed that it hurt more than he expected. And yet, it also hurt less. Because now, there were no more shadows. He turned to her finally, voice low and steady. "Did you love him?" There was a pause. "Yes," she said, barely audible. "At one point, I thought I did." Carl closed his eyes. "And if he were still alive?" he asked. "If you had to choose him or me, who would it be?" She didn't answer. That silence told him everything. He nodded slowly, quietly. "That's why we're done." She cried harder, and he let her. He didn't yell. He didn't storm out. He just sat there and listened to the woman he had loved for half his life come apart beside him. Then, when the tears began to slow, he turned toward her and spoke softly, not with anger, but with a kind of final grace. "You were the only woman I ever loved," he said, "and I would have loved you forever." He leaned over and kissed her gently on the forehead. Not with affection, not with longing, but with goodbye. Then he stepped out of the truck, walked back inside, and left her. In the dark, she didn't follow. Later that night, Carl couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as the weight of everything pressed down on his chest. The truth was out now. The pain no longer lived in questions. It had names, faces, locations, receipts. And yet, something inside him had shifted. The worst of it was over. The unknown had lost its grip. And now, in its place, stood a man who knew exactly what had happened and exactly what he needed to do next. Because healing doesn't start when the pain ends. It starts when you finally stop waiting for the apology to fix it. The next morning, Carl didn't look for her. He made breakfast for the girls, packed lunches, and drove them to school. He waved at the crossing guard, like he always did. And on the way home, he turned up the radio, just a little louder than usual. For the first time, in a long time, it didn't feel like noise, it felt like space. And maybe, just maybe, that space would grow into peace. The snow came early that year in Maple Grove. It covered everything: the lawn, the porch, the past with the thick white silence. The kind of quiet that felt almost sacred. Carl stood by the front window, coffee in hand, watching his daughters build a crooked snowman in the yard. Sophie was laughing. Rachel was trying to stick twigs into the sides. Emily, surprisingly, had joined them, kneeling to pack the base firm. From inside, their giggles sounded like a language he hadn't heard in a long time. It was the first morning he'd smiled. Without guilt, Marlene was gone. Officially, she had moved her things out. 2 weeks ago, after the paperwork was finalized. No lawyers, no drawn-out court appearances. Just signatures, silence, and a shared nod that said, "This is over." She left behind her wedding ring, on the kitchen counter, resting on a yellow post-it note that simply read, "I hope one day you'll find peace." Carl didn't touch the ring for a week. Then one morning, he folded the note in half and placed both in a small wooden box. Not out of bitterness, but because it belonged to the past, and the past needed its own place now. The girls were healing slowly, imperfectly, but visibly. Therapy sessions had become a routine. So had weekend movie nights, pancakes for dinner, and long walks down by the river trail. Carl wasn't trying to recreate what they had lost. He was trying to build something new with what remained. He had expected grief to come in waves. But what surprised him most was what came after the waves pulled back. Space. At first, that space felt like loneliness. Then, over time, it became something else: clarity. He could hear his own thoughts again. He could breathe. He had room to rediscover the parts of himself he'd shelved for years: the old guitar in the attic, the woodworking tools covered in dust, the dusty novels he used to dog gear when he had time to read. And slowly, he began to reach out. At the community center, he started volunteering once a week, helping repair bikes for kids in the neighborhood who didn't have much. On Thursday nights, he joined a small group of divorced dads who met at the local diner for coffee, pie, and quiet conversations that didn't need to be explained. No one judged. No one interrupted. They just listened, and sometimes that was enough. It wasn't about fixing each other. It was about being seen. One evening, after a long shift at the hardware store, Carl sat on the front porch and watched the sunset dip behind the church steeple across town. The sky glowed amber and purple. Rachel sat beside him, her legs swinging off the edge, sipping hot cocoa from a chipped mug that had once belonged to Marlene. She didn't ask about her mom. She didn't need to. "Do you think we'll be okay, Daddy?" she asked. Carl turned to her, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and said the only thing he truly believed now: "I think we already are." That night, he lay in bed and thought about how far they'd come. About the man he was a year ago, blindsided, broken, barely holding on. And the man he was now: not healed, not perfect, but whole in a new way. Not because life went back to what it was, but because he found the courage to step into what it could be. Grief didn't vanish. Love didn't vanish. But both had softened into something else, something you carry without it crushing you. In the days that followed, more small things changed. He started singing again, while doing the dishes. The girls painted the hallway with old family photos. A neighbor stopped by with banana bread and stayed for 2 hours talking about her own divorce, and how it took her 3 years to laugh without guilt. Carl listened, really listened, and realized something he hadn't said aloud before. The storm hadn't destroyed him. It had revealed him, and in that revelation, something beautiful had begun. Not the kind of beauty that makes the pain worth it, but the kind that proves you're still alive, still here, still loving, still choosing to wake up each day and build something gentle in a world that can be so unbearably cruel. That's what rebirth looked like. It didn't come with fireworks or fanfare. It came with quiet mornings, with forgiveness that didn't need permission, with daughters, laughter echoing in the snow-covered yard, with a man sitting on his porch, alone but not lonely, holding a cup of coffee and breathing, just breathing, like that was enough. Because now, for the first time in a long time, it truly was.